Welcome back, everybody, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking at 1 John 1.5 to 7,
Right.
a passage I'm sure you're all familiar with. But you know the drill here. We're not just going to gloss over the surface.
Yeah.
We've got notes from 3 different pastors,
3.
each with a fresh take on this verse. And we're going to pull out some of those sermon illustrations and maybe some unique insights you can use.
It's amazing how much is packed in there
Yeah.
to even the most familiar passages.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start with a sermon from Kanawha Valley Church.
Okay.
This pastor had a really interesting perspective on what it means to walk in the light.
Right. So instead of focusing on like the sin aspect of it, they connected walking in the light to radical honesty and vulnerability.
Okay.
And use the example of the Garden of Eden before the fall, right? Adam and Eve walking around naked, totally unashamed,
Yeah.
totally open, no problem.
Yeah.
And it's like they were saying true Christian fellowship should have that same level of openness.
That's an interesting illustration.
Yeah.
You don't hear that every day.
Not every day.
They even brought in the Greek words for darkness and truth,
Right.
satia and aletheia,
Yes.
to emphasize that it's not just about avoiding bad things, but about being fully known and seen.
Yes, and that was fascinating to me, is how this pastor connects that vulnerability to unity.
Okay.
They argue that true unity doesn't come from pretending to be perfect.
Right.
It comes from letting people see your imperfections and still choosing to love you.
Wow.
It's a powerful message,
It is.
and one that I think really resonates with just our human desire for connection.
Yeah, and then they brought in this really unique illustration using haikus.
Oh, wow.
They talked about how Westerners often miss the beauty of those non-rhyming poems because we're so used to the structure of like rhyming poetry.
Right.
It was like an analogy for how we might miss the richness of Scripture if we try to force it into our preconceived notions.
I wonder if that would land with every congregation. Not everybody's familiar with haikus, or let alone more complex structures like chiasms in the Bible.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It's always a balancing act, finding illustrations that are both fresh and accessible to your audience.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears to the sermon from Janana CF.
Yeah, okay.
This pastor took a different approach, emphasizing the sharp contrast between light and darkness.
Right.
They drew a hard line,
Yeah.
saying there is no middle ground.
Yeah.
And they tied it back to the historical context
Yeah.
of the early church, which was facing all sorts of false teachings.
Yeah.
So they presented 1 John 1.5 to 7 as a call to discern truth from falsehood and to stand firm in what we know to be true.
Right. And I think what I found really interesting is how they linked that idea of discerning truth
Okay.
to the need for strong Christian community.
Yeah.
It's like they were saying that in a world full of conflicting ideas, we need each other to help us stay grounded in the light.
Yeah, because it's easy to get pulled off course
Yes.
when you're trying to navigate all that on your own.
Yes, exactly.
But this pastor didn't stop there. They also connected walking in the light with both love and obedience.
Yes.
Which,
That's interesting.
that's a nuance that
Right.
could easily get lost in a simpler interpretation.
Right.
They argue that God's love is the motivating factor for both
Yes.
loving others and obeying his commands.
That's good.
It's not either.
Right.
It's both hand.
Yeah. It's a really powerful message for a sermon, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
It reminds us that our love for God should be reflected in both our relationships with people and our commitment to following his will.
Yeah.
Okay, ready to move on to our final pastor's perspective.
Let's hear it.
This pastor focused on 1 John 1.57 as a call to authentic living.
Okay.
They really hammered home the point that it's not enough to just claim faith we have to actually live it out.
You know, and they didn't shy away from calling out hypocrisy.
Mhm.
That sometimes creeps into the church.
Right.
And they brought up the example of Ananias and Sapphira
Yeah.
in Acts who lied about their giving. Right.
And faced severe consequences.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder.
Yeah.
God sees through our facades
Right.
and wants us to be genuine.
Yeah.
They also connected this verse to John 8.12,
Okay.
where Jesus calls himself the light of the world.
Which is such a key connection because it implies that following Jesus is synonymous with walking in the light.
Yeah.
And true faith should be visible in our actions, not just our words.
Right. And to drive that point home,
Okay.
they shared this incredibly personal story about jumping off a ledge into a lake when they were younger.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
When pastors use personal stories,
Yeah.
it makes it so relatable.
It does.
What was
Yeah.
the point of the illustration?
They used it as a metaphor for faith.
Okay.
Imagine standing on that ledge,
Yeah.
knowing you need to jump, but not being able to see what's below the surface.
Right. Takes a leap of faith.
It takes a leap of faith, right? But in the spiritual realm, Jesus is our light, illuminating the path ahead, even when we can't see it clearly. Such a powerful image, I think, that could resonate with people.
Yeah.
This idea of needing Jesus as our light when we're facing the unknown.
Right.
Yeah. It's something everybody can relate to.
So we've got 3 distinct approaches to 1 John 1.5 tells Evan here.
Yeah.
Each offering unique insights and potential sermon illustrations.
That's great.
What stands out to you so far?
What strikes me is how each pastor tackled the challenge of making this familiar passage feel relevant and applicable to their congregations.
Right.
They didn't just rehash the obvious point, they dug deeper
Right.
and found these fresh angles that could really challenge people's thinking and inspire them to live out their faith in a more authentic way.
Right.
Yeah, and that's what makes these deep dives so valuable.
Right.
We can take these different approaches and consider how they might work with our congregations.
Exactly. Thinking about that first pastor's point about honesty and vulnerability, it made me wonder, how can we as pastors encourage that kind of openness in our churches?
It's a tricky balance.
Yeah.
You want to create a welcoming environment, but also you don't want to shy away from the hard truths.
Right. And sometimes those truths can make people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Especially if they're used to a more surface level approach to faith.
But I think that's where the power of this passage comes in.
Okay.
1 John 1.57 doesn't just tell us to be good.
Right.
It reminds us that we're all in this together, We all struggle, we all fall short.
Yeah.
But God's grace is sufficient for all of us.
That's such a crucial message.
Yes.
And it ties back to that idea of unity,
Right.
or vulnerability.
Yes.
When we're willing to be open about our imperfections.
Yes.
It creates space for others to do the same.
And that shared experience of brokenness, I think, can actually be a powerful source of bonding.
Okay.
It reminds us we're not alone in our struggles, and we can find strength and support in each other.
And maybe that's the key to moving beyond superficiality in our churches.
Yeah.
It's not about pretending to have it all together.
Right.
It's about being honest about our need for God's grace.
Right.
And for each other.
It's about creating a culture where it's okay to not be okay.
Yeah.
Where people feel safe to bring their whole selves to the table,
right.
Mess and all.
Which is a beautiful picture of what the church should be.
Yeah, for sure.
A place of acceptance, forgiveness, authentic connection.
I was also intrigued by that second pastor's link between walking in the light and being part of a strong Christian community.
Yes. They talked about how the early church faced intense persecution.
Yeah.
And had to rely on each other for support and encouragement.
And, I think that context is so relevant for us today.
Yeah.
Even though the challenges we face may be different.
Right.
We live in a world that's increasingly hostile to Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to feel isolated and discouraged.
Absolutely.
And that's why it's more important than ever
to
be connected to a community of believers who can challenge us, support us, help us stay grounded in our faith.
Absolutely. And that community aspect ties into that pastor's point about love and obedience being intertwined. Because when we're truly walking in the light, it will be evident in both our love for God and our love for others.
And I think that love should motivate us to obey God's commands, not out of fear or obligation, but out of a desire to please him and to reflect his character in our lives.
It's that want to rather than have to approach to obedience.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think that can really make a difference in how we live out our faith.
Now, that third pastor's sermon with that powerful story about jumping off the ledge,
yes,
it really made me think about how we can inspire our congregations to take those leaps of faith.
Because it's one thing to talk about faith, but it's another thing entirely to actually step out in trust.
Right.
Especially when we can't see what's ahead.
And that's where that analogy of Jesus as the light becomes so powerful.
Yes.
It reminds us that even when we're walking through darkness, we're not alone.
Yeah.
God is with us, guiding us, illuminating the path.
It's a message, I think, that can speak to people on such a deep level.
Yeah.
Regardless of background or life experience.
Right.
We all face moments of uncertainty, fear, doubt.
Right.
But if we can hold on to that truth that God is our light,
yeah,
it gives us the courage to keep moving forward.
And I think that's a really important takeaway for us as pastors.
Yeah.
It's not just about teaching people the right doctrines.
Right.
It's about helping them experience the reality of God's presence in their lives.
Yeah.
It's about giving them the tools and encouragement
to
walk by faith, even when they can't see the way.
And maybe that's the essence of what it means to walk in the light. It's not about achieving some level of perfection or having all the answers.
Right.
It's about trusting in God's guidance.
Yeah.
Even when things are uncertain.
Which brings us back to that first pastor's emphasis on honesty and vulnerability.
Yes.
Because when we're willing to admit that we don't have it all figured out, when we're willing to share our struggles, our doubts,
it makes us relatable.
Yeah.
It breaks down those walls of pretense and
yeah.
allows for deeper connection, both with God and with each other.
Right.
And that's where true growth and transformation can happen.
It's like we're starting to see how these three seemingly different approaches to 1 John 1.57 are actually interconnected.
They're like pieces of a puzzle,
Yeah.
you know, each offering a unique perspective.
Right.
But when you put them all together, you get a more complete picture of what it means to walk in the light.
And that picture is so much richer and more nuanced than just a simple list of rules or behaviors.
Yeah.
It's about surrendering to God's transforming grace. Allowing His love to motivate our actions.
Yes.
Trusting in His guidance when the path ahead is unclear.
And doing all of that in the context of a supportive and loving community.
Right.
Where we can be honest about our struggles, encourage one another, and spur each other on towards greater faithfulness.
You know, as we've been talking about these different sermon illustrations, it's made me realize how powerful a well-chosen illustration can be.
Totally.
You know, it can take a complex theological concept and make it come alive for people in a way that they can understand and relate to.
It's like that saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words.
Yeah.
And a good story can be worth 1,000 sermons.
I think that's why that pastor's story about jumping off the ledge was so effective.
Right.
It created this vivid image of what it means to take a leap of faith.
Yeah.
And trusting God's unseen hand.
And it's an image that they can carry with them.
Yeah.
Long after the sermon is over, it can become a touchstone for them.
Right.
Whenever they're facing those moments of uncertainty or fear.
It reminds me of how Jesus often used parables to teach His disciples.
Yes.
He knew that stories could capture people's imaginations.
Yes.
Convey spiritual truths in a way that abstract concepts couldn't.
And they still do.
Yeah.
Thousands of years later. I mean, they tap into something so universal.
Yeah.
Our need for meaning, purpose, and connection.
So maybe one of the key takeaway from this deep dive is not just about the content of these sermons, but about the power of storytelling as a tool for spiritual formation.
It's a good reminder for us that as pastors and Bible study leaders, we need to be not just teachers, but storytellers.
Yes.
You know, we need to find ways to connect with people's hearts as well as their minds.
Absolutely.
To weave together the biblical truths with relatable experiences that can inspire and transform.
Because at the end of the day, it's not just about imparting knowledge.
Right.
It's about helping people encounter the living God in a way that changes their lives.
I love that.
And sometimes the best way to do that is through a story that sticks with them long after the words have faded.
Absolutely. Now, as we think about how to apply these insights to our own ministries, it's important to remember that not every illustration is going to resonate with every audience.
That's true.
You know, I think that's where discernment comes in.
Yeah.
You know, we need to be sensitive to the cultural context and choose illustrations that are both meaningful and appropriate for the people we're speaking to.
It's like that pastor's use of haikus.
Right.
It might have worked for their congregation.
Totally.
But it could fall flat with a group that's unfamiliar with that form of poetry.
Exactly. And I think that's where feedback is so valuable.
Yeah.
You know, we need to be willing to listen to our congregations, to ask for their input and adjust our approach.
Yes.
Based on what they're hearing and understanding.
Absolutely. Because ultimately our goal is to communicate the truth of the gospel in a way that people can grasp and apply to their lives.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means being willing to step outside of our comfort zones and try new things.
It's about being creative, being adaptable, being willing to experiment to see what works best for the people we're called to serve.
Now, as we wrap up our discussion of these three sermons, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how we can bridge the gap between simply knowing this passage
Right.
and actually living it out.
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to understand the concepts of honesty, love, and obedience,
Right.
but it's another thing entirely to put them into practice in our daily lives.
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And I don't think there's a simple answer.
Yeah.
But I do think these three pastors give us some valuable clues.
Okay, let's break it down.
Okay.
Starting with that first pastor's emphasis on radical honesty and vulnerability.
Yeah.
How can we create a church culture where people feel safe to be that open with each other?
You know, it starts with leadership.
Okay.
We as leaders have to model that vulnerability ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to be willing to share our struggles, our doubts, our imperfections.
Right.
Because when we do that, it gives other people permission to do the same.
It's like that saying, vulnerability breeds vulnerability.
That's it. Yeah.
And it also requires us to create safe spaces
Yes.
for those conversations to happen.
Absolutely.
Maybe it's in small groups or in one-on-one mentoring relationships.
Yeah.
But there needs to be an intentional effort
Yes.
to foster an environment of trust and authenticity.
For sure.
And what about that second pastor's point about love and obedience being intertwined?
Right.
How do we communicate that message in a way that's both compelling and practical?
I think it's about highlighting the motivation behind obedience.
Okay. It's not about following rules out of fear or obligation.
Right.
It's about responding to God's love for us. When we truly grasp the depth of his love, it changes our hearts.
Yeah.
We begin to desire to please him.
Yeah.
Not out of fear, but out of gratitude and love.
So it's less about have to and more about want to.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, I think, makes all the difference. You know? Because when obedience flows from a place of love, it becomes a joy, not a burden.
Now that third pastor's call to authentic living, walking the walk, that can feel really daunting for people, especially in a culture that's so focused on appearances.
For sure.
How do we equip people to live out their faith in a genuine and impactful way?
I think it's important to emphasize that walking in the light isn't about being perfect.
Okay.
It's about progress.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
It's about taking one step at a time.
Right.
Relying on God's grace to help us grow. So it's not about striving for some unattainable standard of holiness.
No, not at all. It's about allowing God's love to transform us from the inside out. Right. It's about becoming more like Christ every day.
And that transformation is going to look different for everyone. Right?
Absolutely. We all have our own unique journey, you know, our own areas where we need to grow.
Yeah.
But the key is to be moving in the right direction towards the light.
You know, as we've been talking about these three pastors' perspectives, I've been struck by how interconnected they are.
Yeah.
It's like they each highlight a different facet of what it means to walk in the light.
The honesty and vulnerability of the first, the love-driven obedience of the second, and the authentic living of the third, it all works together to paint a really beautiful and comprehensive picture of what it means to be a follower of Christ.
It's like a tapestry woven together with threads of grace and truth and love.
That's beautiful.
And as we embrace those threads, we'll find ourselves drawn closer to God and to one another.
For sure.
And that's the ultimate goal, isn't it? To live in a way that reflects the love and light of Christ.
Absolutely. And as we do that, we become beacons of hope in a world that desperately needs it.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job.
We did.
Of unpacking these insights from 1 John 1.57.
Yeah.
But here's a final thought I want to leave our listeners with.
Okay.
We've talked about walking in the light as individuals, as a church community.
Right.
But what about walking in the light as a society?
Ooh, that's a good one.
That's a challenge.
Yeah.
But it's a challenge worth considering.
Yeah. How can we apply those principles of honesty, love, and authenticity to the way we engage with the world around us?
That's something for all of us to ponder.
Yes.
And maybe that's the next deep dive.
Let's do it.
Until then, keep seeking the light, friends. You know, it's interesting how this conversation keeps coming back to the idea of vulnerability.
Yeah, it seems like kind of a key theme running through all three of these sermons, even though they all kind of approach it in a slightly different way.
Yeah, it makes me think about how we can encourage that vulnerability, not just from the pulpit, but in the everyday life of our churches.
Yeah, I think it really does require creating a culture where it's safe to be less than perfect,
Right.
to admit our struggles and to ask for help.
Yeah.
And that starts with us as leaders,
Right.
Modeling that behavior.
If we're always projecting an image of having it all together,
Yeah.
it's going to be hard for anyone else to feel comfortable letting their guard down.
People need to see that it's okay to not be okay.
Right.
That everybody struggles.
Yeah.
And that God's grace is big enough to cover it all.
I'm also thinking about that second pastor's emphasis on love and obedience being intertwined. How can we present that in a way that doesn't feel legalistic or burdensome?
I think it's about shifting the focus from external rules to internal transformation.
Okay.
When we truly understand the depth of God's love for us, it changes our hearts. We begin to desire to please him, not out of fear, but out of gratitude and love.
It's like that verse in Romans that says the only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love.
Yes.
Obedience becomes a natural outflow of that love.
Yes. And it's important to remember that obedience isn't always easy.
Right.
It often requires sacrifice, discipline, and a willingness to go against the grain of culture.
Right.
But when it's rooted in love,
it
becomes less about following rules and more about becoming like Christ.
And maybe that's a message that our congregations need to hear more often.
Yeah.
It's not about striving for perfection. It's about allowing God's love to transform us from the inside out.
Totally. Becoming the kind of people who naturally do what's right. Yeah.
Not because we have to, but because we want to.
Now, that third pastor's call to authentic living, walking the walk.
It's a good one.
That can feel really daunting for people.
It can. Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of people get stuck.
Yeah.
They know what they should believe. They have good intentions.
Right.
But they struggle to translate that belief into action.
Yeah. And it can be intimidating to step out in faith when we don't know what the outcome will be.
Right.
It's like that pastor's analogy of jumping off the ledge into the lake.
Yes.
You have to trust that there's something there to catch you even though you can't see it.
But that's where the power of the Holy Spirit comes in.
Right.
He gives us the courage, the strength, the guidance we need to take those leaps of faith.
Yeah.
And the more we step out in obedience, the more we experience the faithfulness of God.
Right.
And the more our faith grows.
It becomes a cycle of trust and growth. And as our faith deepens,
our actions begin to reflect that inner transformation.
Right.
It's not about trying to earn God's favor, but about responding to his love in a way that naturally spills over into every area of our lives.
And that's the kind of authentic living that will draw people to Christ.
Right.
When they see that genuine love, joy, and peace that comes from walking in the light.
Right.
It will be irresistible.
It's a powerful testimony.
It is.
To the transformative power of the gospel.
So maybe the key takeaway from all of this is that 1 John 1.57 isn't just a theological statement.
Right.
It's a call to action.
Right.
It's a challenge to live out our faith in a way that's real, relatable, and relevant to the world around us.
It's about letting God's love shine through us in a way that makes a difference.
And as we do that, we'll not only experience the fullness of life that God intended for us, but we'll become agents of his grace and truth in a world that desperately needs it.
And that's a mission worth embracing. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into 1 John 1.5-7.
It's been great.
We hope you've gleaned some valuable insights and inspiration for your own ministries.
Always a pleasure.
Until next time, keep seeking the light, friends.